In the hush of a southern summer evening, the kind where porch swings creaked in rhythm with the cicadas, a young boy named Isaiah would press his ear to the wooden boards of his grandmother's veranda. It wasn't that the wood could talk, but somehow it held memories. Whispered echoes of the past, a past full of things America had packed away in dusty trunks and locked deep in the attic of time. The 1950s are often dressed up in chrome and cheer, jukeboxes, rockin' and roll, smiling milkmen, and Sunday dinners. But behind the glossy commercials and white picket fences were stories left to wilt in silent stories of black life. Dignity defied injustice, delayed, and tucked between them were 50 things now forgotten. Not because they lacked meaning, but because they carried the weight of inconvenient truth. There was the Green Book, for one. Not a novel or a feel-good film, but a life-preserving guide for black travelers' parents with children, war veterans, school teachers, all trying to cross a country where a whites-only sign could mean danger, even death. It listed gas stations where they wouldn't be turned away, hotels where they might sleep a night without fear, diners where a warm plate wouldn't come with a side of humiliation. In 1950s America, the road was never just a road. It was a gamble, and the Green Book was a lifeline, and there were the sit-ins, long before they became headlines. In Greensboro and elsewhere, young men and women sat quietly at lunch counters, their dignity refusing to flinch while insults rained down like ash. These weren't spontaneous bursts of bravery. They were rehearsed, strategic, and profoundly powerful. Those sit-ins were one of the 50 forgotten things, because we forget too often that courage is not loud. Sometimes it's silent and still. And it sits in a vinyl booth with its back straight and eyes forward. Isaiah's grandmother, Miss Luella, had once worked at a department store on the 3rd floor. In the back, behind a curtain where black women hemmed dresses for white girls they'd never be allowed to shop beside. She remembered when colored patrons couldn't try on hats for fear their hair might taint the merchandise. Isaiah would sit by her feet, wide-eyed as she recalled the sting of being good enough to sew pearls into another girl's prom gown, but not good enough to walk through the front door. There were the neighborhood record stores, too. Long vanished now places like Tuck's Vinyl in Detroit or Big Al's in Birmingham, where dusty shelves held the voices of Sam Cooke and Dinah Washington, telling stories the radio didn't always want to play. Black voices, muffled by the mainstream, but blaring like prophecy in those little record shops. For many, those songs were more than music. They were proof that someone, somewhere, understood. And who remembers the beauty shops? The ones run from back porches or tiny converted kitchens where black women wielded hot combs like scepters. There, dignity was done up in pin curls and pressed hair. Gossip flowed, but so did strategy about school board meetings, voter registration drives, or how to handle the nosy sheriff's new patrol route. Those salons were power centers, not just beauty parlors. They are forgotten, but they built resistance strand by strand. There were children's books that never saw the inside of white libraries because they dared show black joy, or family, or pride. There were sports heroes like Althea Gibson, who broke tennis records and racial barriers, but whose name never quite sat on American tongues the way others did. And there were everyday heroes, the Pullman porters who folded napkins with white gloves and tucked black pride into every crisp corner of a linen train car. The street Isaiah lived on had a candy store run by Mr. Henry, a veteran of the war who never spoke much about France or battlefields, but on his wall was a photo of his unit black men in uniform, grinning like they'd won more than just a battle. Because they'd worn the same uniform as white soldiers, saluted the same flag, but came home to the same Jim Crow. Back then, you could be a hero overseas and still be boy at home, another forgotten thing. The bus seat protest in Baton Rouge, 1953. 2 years before Rosa Parks, before Montgomery, there was a bus boycott in Louisiana led by Rev. T.J. Jemison, quiet, deliberate, and strategic. The city tried to erase it, history tried to overlook it, but it mattered. It taught organizers how to build the next fight. Every movement had a rehearsal before the curtain went up. Even the food told stories. Isaiah's mother used to bake a sweet potato pie passed down from her great aunt who once cooked for the white folks up on Green Hill. She'd learned to season sorrow with cinnamon. Recipes were legacies, coded messages of survival and celebration, written in butter and brown sugar. Food was one of the few things black families could call their own, even when land and wages and worth were stolen. In black churches across the country, especially on the second Sunday, the air would thicken with both praise and protest. Pastors thundered beneath stained glass, but they also counseled families who couldn't find housing or had been denied at the ballot box. Churches weren't just for worship, they were war rooms. Forgotten now, perhaps, but central then to every step forward. And while we remember Emmett Till's name, do we remember the whispers of other children who vanished, whose parents couldn't make it to Chicago press conferences or Jet magazine covers? Black pain in the 1950s wasn't always national news. Sometimes it was just a mother crying into her apron on a Tuesday morning after a sheriff refused to file a report. But there was joy too, joy that defied oppression. Joy that danced at midnight on kitchen tiles after a long shift. Joy that hummed through Ella Fitzgerald on a second-hand radio. Black joy in the 1950s was radical, it was resistance. It said, "I am still here, even when the world insisted otherwise." There were school books, handed down from white schools, scribbled with Negro in red marker. But inside those pages, young minds like Isaiah's lit up. There were science fairs in basements, spelling bees at church halls, dreams of becoming doctors, lawyers, poets. Even when the system said no, the imagination said yes. Miss Luella used to keep a scrapbook of clippings from the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. "You won't find our stories." In the regular papers, she'd say, tapping the yellowing pages, "You have to look where they don't want you to look." Those black newspapers were lifelines, telling the truth when no one else dared. And then there were the letters, so many letters, between soldiers and sweethearts, students and parents, freedom fighters and strangers. Letters that carried prayers and plans that said, "I'm trying," or "I miss you," or "Don't give up." Some were burned, others lost, but all of them mattered. There are so many things we've let slip into the shadows of the 1950s. It wasn't just about malt shops and sock hops. It was about fight and fire, struggle and survival. It was about making room for dignity in a world designed to deny it. Isaiah, grown now and gray at the temples, still keeps his grandmother's porch swing. On quiet nights, when the world is noisy with distraction, he rocks gently back and forth, listening not just for memories, but for truth. Because truth, like history, doesn't vanish. It just waits patiently to be remembered. Isaiah's swing creaked beneath him as dusk gave way to the soft hush of night. Fireflies blinked in and out like memory fragments, flickers of a time too heavy to carry, too sacred to forget. And even as the world around him changed, technology buzzing, buildings rising, voices louder than ever, he knew the 1950s still whispered beneath it all. A decade buried not by time, but by choice. There were the ice cream parlors, segregated like everything else, where white children giggled at soda fountains, while black children stared through windows, their dimes just as shiny but unwelcome. Those dimes often ended up at Miss Thelma's shop instead, tucked in the back of her home, where she served the best hand-churned strawberry scoop this side of Mississippi. It wasn't about the ice cream, it was about having a place, a seat, a name. And then there were the library's whole sections closed off to black readers who were told to use the Negro branch, if one existed at all. Yet despite the limits, black minds soared, pages turned in secret. Young girls like Isaiah's cousin Lenore read Maya, Angelou by lamplight, scribbling poems in the margins of recycled notebooks. Knowledge was stolen, scavenged, shared, but never surrendered. In small towns across the South, there were black-owned movie theaters modest, sometimes barely more than a screen and some chairs, but inside those dark rooms, communities laughed, cried, and escaped together. The white theaters had balconies where colored patrons were herded. But in places like the Royal Theater in St. Louis or the Lincoln in Harlem, folks sat wherever they pleased. Dignity didn't need plush seats. It needed space to breathe, and who now remembers the teachers' homes, those simple dwellings beside segregated schools, where black teachers lived because the towns didn't want them renting among white folks? These were women and men with college degrees, walking miles through dust and heat, teaching children in hand-me-down classrooms. giving their brilliance to a system that gave so little in return. They didn't teach for the money. They taught because they believed. There was a man named Curtis, Isaiah's uncle, who used to deliver coal in the winter. His hands were always blackened, his face smudged with soot, but he'd tip his cap every time he passed a lady. One day, a white customer refused to pay him, saying Curtis had tracked mud on the porch. "Mud don't come from the solace of your boots," Curtis later told Isaiah. "It comes from the hearts of people who can't see your soul." That moment, long ago, was one of 50 forgotten things, the quiet dignity of black laborers, who endured insult after insult but never let it steal their manhood. On Saturday nights, the Juke Joints lit up. Places like Club de Lisa or the Dewdrop Inn, where the beat hit like thunder and the bass line was black joy itself. It was where black folks danced off the week's ache, laughed in defiance of oppression, and found love in rooms thick with sweat and saxophones. Those joints are mostly gone now, but their echoes remain, ghost notes carried through generations. Even funerals told a story. Segregated cemeteries laid black bodies in the back rows, even in death. But in black funeral homes, often the only black-run businesses allowed to thrive, there was reverence, pride, and the tradition of honoring our own. Suits, pressed, hymns sung, lives celebrated with the dignity often denied in life. In grief, there was resistance. And in mourning, a commitment to remember. Back in schoolrooms, there were black history clubs formed unofficially because textbooks didn't tell the full truth. Students met after class to talk about Crispus Attucks, Sojourner Truth, and Benjamin Banneker. They painted murals of greatness that didn't exist in their school books. Because sometimes you have to create your own mirror when the world refuses to show your reflection. There were corner stores where black families could buy on credit, not because the owner was rich, but because he understood the struggle. There were tailor shops, shoeshine boys, domestic workers, millions of ordinary black people doing extraordinary things simply by surviving with grace. These stories weren't sensational. That's why they were forgotten. But they were the foundation of everything. Isaiah recalled the taste of well water from his uncle's farm. How, in the summers, children ran barefoot through cotton fields, not for play, but because their parents had no choice but to bring them along during the harvest. That cotton, the same cotton that built empires, left little hands bleeding, even in 1956, and still, black children found games in the dirt, hope in the sky, and laughter between the rows. And in homes across the South and North alike, radios buzzed with voices of reason and rebellion. Malcolm, Martin, Fannie Lou Hammar. But there were also voices the history books forgot: local preachers. Mothers with bullhorns, teenagers with typewriters, folks who didn't march on Washington, but still marched into history. Forgotten, yes, but only because we stopped looking. Isaiah once asked his grandmother what kept her going in the 1950s. "You," she'd said, without hesitation. "You children, we didn't have the luxury to break. We had to bend, but not break." There was so much bending back then around rules, laws, hatred, but somehow the black spirit did not snap. It carried children through burning towns, husbands through courtrooms where justice never came, mothers through dinner tables with not enough to feed all mouths, but still enough love to make it taste like a feast. There were weddings in backyards and baptisms in rivers. There were Sunday drives in borrowed cars, dressed in one's finest even if the trip was only 2 blocks. Because black dignity was deliberate. It was not allowed. It was claimed, and then there were the things hidden in plain sight. The sundown towns that warned black families to be gone by dusk. The redlining maps that kept families from buying homes. The banks that smiled in your face and laughed at your loan application. And yet, despite it all, black families built brick by brick, dream by dream. Isaiah, now old enough to see the world try to repeat itself, speaks to his grandchildren from that same porch swing. "Don't just remember the protests," he says. "Remember the pie sales that paid for the gas to get to the protests. Remember the old man who fixed shoes for free so little boys had something nice to wear to school. Remember the soft things too, the poems, the lullabies, the resilience in a grandmother's hands." The 1950s weren't just about what was taken. They were about what was kept: pride, community, faith, and a vision of a future where no one would need a green book, where every lunch counter would serve every child, where cemeteries no longer segregated the dead. That vision lived in barbershops, in kitchens, in long walks to school, in choir rehearsals, in union meetings, in whispers and in roars. It lived in 50 forgotten things. Things that, when remembered, don't just tell us where we came from, but show us what we survived and how we rose. So, as Isaiah's swing moves back and forth beneath the moonlight, he hums a song from long ago, one his mother used to sing while shelling peas on the porch. A song about freedom and rivers and crossing over. It's not on the radio. It's not in the books, but it's in his bones, in all of ours. And maybe that's the thing America forgot most of all, that history lives not in monuments or headlines, but in the quiet strength of those who were never supposed to be remembered, but who endured anyway. Black America in the 1950s was not passive. It was not defeated. It was rising slowly and surely, like a song too powerful to silence,